East and West learning connections.
Helps people of different cultures break barriers and connect with each other.
Okay, thank you, Yang, for introduction. Yeah, okay. So just as we agreed last time, I would quickly paraphrase what I just said in Chinese because we have some English-speaking audience here. And also this part is meant for English discussion. So I'll quickly paraphrase what I just said, then we can go to the discussion questions. So basically what I said earlier was just to introduce us to reflect on our experiences with the oath taking at the Canadian citizenship ceremony. Yeah, so by going to look at the words, we can see a few keywords here: a king, law, and constitution. Because not every country has a king, right? So that's why we want to highlight that. And also, it's important to be aware of that because because if we want to understand how the Canadian government work, yeah, so we will need to say all those parties what kind of roles they play. So then I went to talk about the Canadian rights and responsibility. I highlight some rights like um, mobility rights, official language rights, minority language education rights, multicultural rights, and also the responsibilities, including being a law, taking responsibility for oneself and one's family, serving on jury, and also I mentioned about the voting, and also the obligation of helping others in community. I especially wanted to appreciate the work Wang Yang and her organization is doing. This is a perfect example of showing how we can help people by volunteering ourselves for the sake of the community. So then I went to break down a little bit the structure of the federal government to show how the different parts of the government are working together to make the country in operation. And also I mentioned about how the laws are made in Canada, which probably is different from some countries, and we can discuss more in the discussion question part. Uh, then I quickly mentioned about how the Canadian responsible government was involved. So it was to do with the responsible government in Britain first, then in British North America, then today. Yeah, basically. Um, yeah, so that's what we discussed. So now I'm going to play the role of facilitator. So that's to say, I have done a lot of talking now. So I hope that you will be doing the talking. Yeah, so it's time for us to share your experiences, your puzzlements, and questions. And we have Terry, our consultant, is with me. So and he is happy to be challenged as well. If you have difficult question, he doesn't mind. He doesn't mind answering them. So what I'm trying to say is use this opportunity to talk to our consultant. Okay, so the first question, it's to do with the lecture actually. For those of you who were participating in the oath taking the Canadian citizenship ceremony, my questions for you are, when did you swear the oath of citizenship? Like, how did you feel during the ceremony? Yeah. So let's just hear each other about our stories. Yeah. I believe it was one of the historic moments for your life journeys, right? So anybody's willing to share your experience with us?
Yes, can I?
Oh yeah, Tracy, right?
Yes. To me, my experience was, you apply for the citizenship, then after a certain amount of time, they will accept your application, and they would email you, that you have been accepted, and
Mm.
they will arrange kind of a virtual oath. So a date was settled. Then you just attended virtually that process. So how did I feel during the ceremony? I think it's kind of very serious and solemn process because we need to follow the facilitator. I don't know how to say that,
Uh-huh.
to read every single word. So
Oh, the
it's kind of
officiant. Yeah.
a solemn process for me.
Hmm. Yeah, I think you were referring to the officiant or the presider of the ceremony.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
Uh, yeah, great. Yeah, so just by listening to you, I assume your ceremony took place during the COVID period?
No, after that,
Oh, okay.
2024, I think, or 2025, I can't remember, but
Oh, it's quite
after
recent.
COVID.
Oh, okay. It's yeah, it's a little bit surprise to me that the virtual method is still available. Okay.
Yes, actually, a lot of person that, but uh, you can see that's a Zoom meeting. You can see a lot of face.
Oh, yeah, great. Thank you for sharing, Tracy. So, anybody else is willing to share your experience with us?
It, I became citizen in 2017. Yeah,
Wow.
it's quite a solemn event. I'm glad I become a Canadian citizen. However, like in the oath, uh, I don't have much feel for king or queen, you know. I just, came to the country. I'm happy to be a citizen, but I do not really have that heritage link to the king and queen in Great Britain. So that's my feel. I don't know how, like, for local Canadians, but they're born here. They do not need to take any oaths. So.
Uh, right. That's interesting. Actually,
Mm.
we have a great person we want to hear from because they did not have to go through the process we had to. So
Mhm.
Terry's here. Let me ask Terry. So Terry, when did you swear the oath of the citizenship?
Never.
Never. Okay. Yeah. So
Why?
yeah.
It
But
isn't.
Terry, you were born in Britain, right? You were born in the UK, right?
Correct. I
So when
did
you
get
came
my
here,
Canadian citizenship in 1974, but I had been here since 1952. And the reason I got my Canadian citizenship is because, or I applied for it, is because I wanted to receive my permanent teacher's certificate. And you could not get one without being a Canadian citizen, but you could work at pretty well every other job if you were born in a Commonwealth country. I was born in England in 1943, and I came here in 1952. My
Mm.
mother never received her Canadian citizenship, or my stepfather,
Mm.
and they lived here until they died.
Okay. Ian raised his hand. Ian?
Hi there. Thanks for the opportunity to sit in on this. This is really fun. Um, the thing with allegiance to the King of England, I think, is a holdover from before the Constitution was repatriated. And it was, as far as I understand it, Terry, you might be able to correct me on this, but um, the way it used to work was that Canada, being a dominion, operated under the oversight of the British Parliament and with allegiance to the King of England. And the idea there was that in a dominion, the king delegates his or her power to the governor general here in Canada. and that governor general operates as the right hand of the king. But during the period that British Parliament was still our overseer, legislation would have to be passed by the Canadian Parliament, and then it would have to be sent to England to be ratified. Is that correct?
Well, that's partly correct. In fact, the reason for having a governor general, which we still have, is to have a head of state that is above politics in the party sense. In other words, the head of state of Canada is still the king, but is represented by the governor general, so that she, for example, signs all the bills that have been passed by Parliament. If they're not signed by her, then they're not law. And previously, before the patriation of the Constitution, which was when it was brought to Canada, of course, it was the British North America Act, an act of the British Parliament, which was passed in 1867 and signed by Queen Victoria, which is why we have Victoria Day. Maybe you wondered why the 24th of May is described as Victoria Day. In other words, if you entirely remove the British legacy, you remove the government of Canada in principle, because it's modeled on the Westminster system. In other words, if you want to understand in depth the parliamentary system in Canada, you have to understand the Westminster system's history in Britain. And I don't want to go on too long. I don't want to hog the the discussion here, but suffice to say this, that the British government had a revolution, the British state had a revolution in the 1600s. And the result of that revolution was that it was absorbed by the British state. Although a king lost his head, quite literally, Charles I, later the monarchy was restored, but the people, and the people who were objecting to the rule of an absolute king, gained a lot more power because of the increased strength of Parliament. So, for example, our head of government is called a prime minister. Well, that means a minister to the crown. If you're dealing with things involving, for example, treaty rights in Canada, if you were an Indigenous person dealing with the federal government about your treaty rights, you're dealing directly with the crown. That doesn't mean Charles physically, personally, but it does mean the level of the governor general. So that the governor general functions as the crown does in Britain, as a symbol of the system. And it's a system which has evolved rather than having a revolution that had to start again from nothing. Now, I'm afraid I have to bring in here an obvious contrast. The United States, which was 13 British colonies that rebelled successfully against the crown and Parliament and set up a republic. We know, I think, that the head of state in the United States, Mr. Trump at present, but any president, is elected directly by the people. One person, one vote. That was thought of, although it didn't include people of a certain color or people of a certain gender, that idea was thought of in the 18th century when the United States was set up in 1775 to 83. As you know, the Independence Day ceremonies are on July the 1st in the United States, July the 4th in the United States, when they declared independence from the not just Britain in the sense of another country, but actually a system, and they set up a new system. Canada never set up a new system. It did what Britain did with its own system, which is to change it. And this was what Stephen was talking about when he referred to responsible government, to change it step by step so that the power flowed up instead of down. It was conceived of as an absolute monarchy, but it became, in fact, a constitutional monarchy. That's why we call Canada a constitutional monarchy. And there are monarchies in the world that are less, or perhaps not even at all, constitutional. The United States broke with the monarchical system in the 18th century. Now, people like me would, because my area of study was theory and philosophy of politics, um, would argue that our system is better because we have a more stable system of change. There is change in it, but we don't have to have periodic revolutions in order to make those changes. The United States has had two, in my opinion, revolutions, which were both civil wars. The first one was the one we all call the American Revolution, and the second one was called the American Civil War. And Canada's Constitution came into force very significantly as a result of people living here not wanting to have what they'd just seen happening in the early 1860s in the United States. One set of states attacking the other.
Mhm.
Or I guess you could say each of the two, the North and the South, attacking one another, and of course, killing hundreds of thousands of people. The reason that the United States became the greatest immigration country in the late 19th century that had ever existed in history is because they'd lost so many people in their Civil War. Now, I can go on for a long time here, but
I wanted to just
helps.
draw it back to that sort of pivotal moment in the early 1980s when the British North America Act gave way to the repatriation of the Canadian Constitution.
Correct.
And I want to press on the word Constitution because the Constitution is really a description of how Canada is constituted.
Right.
Yes?
Absolutely.
So the idea there is that until the Constitution came home to Canada, it was only the British Parliament that could change the Constitution of Canada, the way that Canada is organized and how it operates.
Well, actually, it was the Privy Council in Britain. Laws would be approved. It wouldn't have to go through the British Parliament. That was the only thing that you said in your original statement that wasn't correct.
Okay.
Everything else you said was correct. But the Canadian laws would be referred to the British Privy Council, which is not Parliament, and would be rubber stamped, unless, of course, they were proposing exploding the world or something. But essentially, it was just a sort of rubber stamping. You're quite right. Until it was patriated, and the term is patriated rather than repatriated because it wasn't here before. Until it was patriated, it wasn't Canadian, and something very significant was added, which had British and American roots. The American roots actually went back to Britain on this one, and this was the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And for several decades prior to the patriation of the Constitution, people in both parties, both of the major parties in Canada, were attempting to have something like this introduced, a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. John Diefenbaker, for those of you who are old enough to remember, as I am, was a conservative prime minister, was one of the persons to most push for this. And he was very, very pro-British as a person, but he thought we need to have a Charter of lawyer out west, and he'd spent a lot of his practice defending people who were not being treated as he thought as well as they should be, who were of other than British background. So he thought we needed a Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it really goes back to a conservative prime minister. And an evolution occurred in 1982 when the charter was when the Constitution was patriated, signed by the Queen. And of course, this was Mr. Trudeau Sr., Pierre Trudeau, who was prime minister at the time. So I'll stop talking there.
Very.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And Terry, thank you for sharing. So I think you mentioned that Canada was unique in the discussions we just had, right? So as I also mentioned in the lecture, a lot of newcomers in Canada, they don't understand that. They just assume that Canada is the same as the USA. But as just we discussed, with regard to the Canadian system, actually it's quite different from the USA. So Terry, you just said Canada was unique in that way. Can you say a little bit more about that? Why the Canadian Constitution is unique?
Yes, the reason it's one of a kind, it's not totally unique, of course, because Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth countries have similar situation to Canada. But the reason Canada is, in a sense, unique in that it was constituted as a bicultural country. So long before the Americans invented the term multicultural, it's an American term that was invented by some American sociologists, one of whom was a politician, to describe why the United States, despite the fact that it's a unilingual, officially, country, and has had millions and millions of immigrants into the country from non-English speaking backgrounds, has not succeeded in being the melting pot that a lot of Americans thought it should be. In other words, melted down into Americans. And it was originally a study of New York by these sociologists, Nathan Glazer and Daniel P. Moynihan, for those who want to look this up, who wrote a book on the subject, explaining why New Yorkers retained ethnic differences, such as Italian, Puerto Rican, whatever it was, despite being there for generations. The term in Canada, which I think is preferable, now multicultural is the one we use, is the term mosaic. Because as you know, a mosaic, if you know what a mosaic is in a physical sense, it's a number of different stones of different types and colors that are put together to form a picture. But there is a framework. Now that's a lot more like how Canada actually grew, not because of military actions, either within or without the country, but because of adding something to the frame. There is a frame, and the frame was the one that was given to us by our legacy from the British Empire. Now, of course, the British Empire doesn't really exist. Even the British Commonwealth is a pretty flimsy thing. But we've retained a historical link, including the French connection, and it's within a frame. That's the framework. But within that, we're able to allow and encourage, in fact, under the law, groups to develop their own cultural identity. We've never really had that fight between, is it going to be a melting pot or is it going to be just a bunch of different countries or areas? We haven't really ever had that fight because it's an evolutionary concept rather than a revolutionary concept. So I'll stop talking again.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. Even Canada chose to keep the monarchy, right? While the United States was totally cut off from the connection to the king and the queen of the Britain, right?
It was actually cutting the roots in history. Now, again, I won't shut me up if you.
Yeah, we still have time.
You may have pressed the wrong button here.
We still have time.
Getting more than you anticipated. But the thing is that the United States structure is quite different from Canada's. Both countries follow the same general political philosophy, which is called liberal democracy, or if you prefer, liberal social democracy, because that brings in the ideas of a democratic socialism, which is allowed in both countries. But the structure of the country is quite different. The United States name tells you what it is: United States. A state has an independence to it. We don't have United States in Canada. We have provinces. The analogy for those of you who are from China, mainland China particularly, would know that a province is part of a state. A province is not uh, uh, possibly independent. Now, we've had independence movements, as you know, historically, first in Quebec for reasons of the Québécois, and more recently in the West for reasons of the Albertans, people of Saskatchewan. But I would argue, and this is what I used to argue when I was teaching this sort of stuff, that we're better able to handle that, because it would be constitutionally impossible, not impossible physically, but constitutionally impossible to declare independence in Alberta. And Miss Smith actually knows that. And of course, the current separatist movement in Quebec, which has been around since the beginning of the 20th century, knows that as well. So in Canada, separatist movements tend to function because it's such a big country with different circumstances in the country, difficult to govern as well by a central government. They function as good pressure groups for local interests actually being heard. As you probably know, the Western separatists were saying for years, before Mr. Harper, was basically saying, let the West in, meaning we're being ignored. And Quebec has always been saying, you're trying to swamp us and with your language and so, or bringing in all these immigrants that cannot become French speaking, or whatever the issue is. So the way those issues come up in Canada is a way that is not necessarily going to lead to the country falling apart. It can handle that within the constitutional monarchy.
Okay.
That used to be my argument when I was teaching Canadian studies for why
So Terry,
better system.
can I ask a question? So why it is constitutional impossible for, say, a province to declare independence? Why?
Because they'd have to take up arms. The Constitution doesn't allow for independence. If you look at the American Constitution, and I'd have to explain it a little bit more, there's something called states' rights. Now, states' rights is what the southern states argued when they were, from the northern states' point of view, rebels. They seceded from the Union. Well, they could because it was a union. United States, not a bunch of provinces, United States. Canada's constitution does not identify the provincial governments, and this is reflected in the fact that the lieutenant governors of each province are approved by the governor general. In other words, you know what as Americans call it, a lieutenant, or as a German would call it, a lieutenant, or a French call it lieutenant. That's a helper. That's a person whose work in the army. That's a person who's helping the higher commander. Well, the lieutenant governors are that. They're lieutenant governors. They're not the governors of the country. That system goes back to the colonial times, but I think it's a sensible system because it retains the fact that Canada was conceived of as a unitary state. The United States was not conceived of as a unitary state. And that's why you have governors of various states in the United States, even today, and you've always had this, saying, we're not going to do whatever it is that the federal government of the United States says they should do, and arguing that they have the state's right to do that. Nobody in Canada has the right to do that because Alberta, Quebec, Ontario are not states. They're provinces. So in addition to not understanding language very well, which is what quite a lot of people do when they're listening to the news, whether it's the news of the mass media or whether it's the news, social news, social media. They're often using language in a way that it doesn't actually mean that at all. So one other thing I've just mentioned here that I think is very important, and this is why constitutional monarchy, such as Canada, and I think Canada is a very good example of one that works extremely well, is better than the congressional system they have in the United States. The President of the United States, and certainly the current one, whatever you feel about his policies, is behaving as if he's a king. That's why they have all of these demonstrations, no kings and all that stuff. Now, why are they doing that? Why are Americans doing that don't like what he's doing? Because in their Constitution, his powers are separate from the powers of Congress. There are two houses of Congress, as there are two houses of Parliament. Both of them in the United States are elected. As you probably know, the House of Representatives is elected by population. So, for example, Pennsylvania and California and New York State that have lots and lots of people have lots and lots of representatives. But the upper house, the Senate, which is also elected, only has two members from each state. And it doesn't matter whether it's Rhode Island, which is tiny, or whether it's California, which is huge. In other words, it's nothing to do with population, but they're all elected. So they can all say, oh, we're very democratic, because democratic means elected. Yes, it does mean elected. But the president, of course, is independent, separate in terms of powers from Congress. The president of the United States is not a member of Congress. So technically what he does needs to be approved by Congress. For example, declaring war is supposed to be declared by Congress, is supposed to be approved by Congress. Now, the president is the commander-in-chief of the army, and the current president hasn't declared war. He's simply undertaken a war. And the people in Congress who don't agree with him say this has to be done by, he's not listening to them. So you could not have a prime minister like that. We don't have a president. We have a king and a governor general, and they're people who sign papers, right? They have a symbolic power, but they don't have a physical power, as it were. The decisions are all made by Parliament. So in Canada, in the Canadian system, the parliamentary democracy, the seat of power is Parliament. Well, let's think about the Prime Minister. Doesn't he have a massive amount of power? Technically, no. He is a representative of his constituency, which is in Alberta. And the previous Prime Minister had a constituency in Quebec, right? The people who voted for Mr. Carney were not the people of Canada. They were the people of his constituency out west. Well, why does he have all of this power? Because of the party system. Well, you might say, well, why don't we get rid of the party system? It's just a myth. It's just a sort of lie. Well, because if you know where it comes from, it's better than what we had before. Before in the history of the English-speaking peoples, they didn't call them parties. If they'd used the language of today, they would have called them gangs. Okay. A party and the party system has to follow the responsibilities and rights and responsibilities of the Constitution. And one of those is not to carry guns into Parliament, right? The United States has a constitution in which people can carry guns as part of their Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which they call the amendments to the Constitution, right? So Americans can carry guns to shoot people, technically speaking. Why is that? Why the difference? Because America began as a revolution. It began with people rebelling against a constituted authority and overthrowing it. Well, what can we do about it? Maybe nothing. You've got to start with that. We had rebellions in 1837 in Upper and Lower Canada, but they were unsuccessful. They didn't succeed in overthrowing the government. So the Canadian solution to the problem of differences was to follow the responsible government principle, which began in England with the Great Reform Bill. You saw that. There it is there. The Great Reform Bill, 1832. Well, in Canada, a governor was sent over from England to try and fix the problem here as to why people were fighting and rebelling against the government. And what did he recommend? Two things. English and French shouldn't be two languages, only one language. Well, that didn't work because, of course, the French wouldn't accept that. Well, at the time, and it turned out to be a wise decision, I believe, to be bilingual, to have a bilingual country. And then that could later be multicultural, not just bicultural. And the other aspect of it that he recommended that was accepted, and you can read this in the history books, is in sort of high school history books, is responsible government. The upper and lower Canadians, as they were called at the time, which is to say Quebec and what is now Ontario, came together in 1870. And in 1871, laws were passed which allowed the two, at the time, colonies to have a responsible system of government. And Stephen showed you a sort of model of how the government works now. Well, when I used to teach this to students from Ningbo in China, whose language was not as good as yours, I mean, I'm talking about English, they didn't know much English, I used to call this a house or a hotel. And originally in this house or hotel, which of course is the British state and the colonies that were based on that, the power came from the top, which was the king and his friends, the lords. That's called the House of Lords in England. And then the commons, which were the common people. And the king and his friends told the commons what to do. This is not responsible government. This is the medieval system, which was carrying on in Britain. What in fact happened was, in responsible government, is that the assembly, which is the lowest part, the House of Commons as it's called today, sent up the messages to the next level, which was in Britain the House of Lords, here called, because they didn't have lords, the Senate, and they passed it on up to the king's ministers, meaning his advisors, his helpers. So if you just think about the term prime minister itself, what does it mean? Servant. What's a minister? It's a servant. We don't, they don't call them ministers in the United States. The president has cabinet members, and they're not members of Congress. They're his pals. If he's a great guy, great. If he's a gangster, no names being mentioned, not so great. So you see what I mean? In other words, we got a better system. I'll stop my speech.
Yeah, Judith, raise your hand. Judith?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
So one of the things that we haven't talked about is proportional representation.
Yes.
And that is what is, I think, terribly missing from the democratic process in our election process. I don't know. Do you have
Yes.
any comment?
Do you want me to explain what proportional representation is?
Sure.
Okay, proportional representation means that in elections involving party politics, and we know that our elections involve party politics. We haven't really talked about what the parties are, but let's just assume that we know. Liberals, conservatives, NDP, smaller parties like the Green Party, the Communist Party of Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The People's Party is another recent one that's emerged. Because of the way the constituencies, meaning the various voting areas, are set up geographically, it means that the votes in particular areas are going to be more influential than in others because it's based on representation by population. However, how you divide the constituencies. However, in the actual voting, it's what's called first past the post. Now that's system. That's using the idea of a horse race. If you go and see horse races, you'll see that the horse that runs past the post, or if you go to the Olympics and the first runner, he wins, right? So in each of these constituencies, the person who wins a majority of votes, purely and simply, wins the seat. So you can see, I think, that there is the likelihood that there is going to be a disproportionate representation of the voters. And people would argue, and people have argued at great length, that it would be much better to have not the first past the post system, but a system of proportional representation in which the vote for a particular party is the thing that would determine the membership of the members of parliament. How many members of parliament, for example, should there be, considering that the vote of, let's just say, the Conservatives was higher than it was in the last election than the Liberals? Well, it actually was, if you look at across the country. So we shouldn't really have a Liberal Party government at the moment on a sort of crude proportional representation theory. Now, what's the argument is it's more democratic, which it fairly obviously is. And this argument has been made or has been discussed since the 1920s. What caused it not to quickly be put in? European politics. How did Hitler get elected? The German system under the Weimar Republic in the 1920s and then after the First World War was proportional representation. 7 million Germans voted for Adolf Hitler when he eventually became, as you know, the dictator of Germany. And that wasn't the only thing that got him in. A leader of a very small, insignificant group, if you look at their how many people were voting for them in the early 1920s, very few. But it was also other things in the German system, which was based on, it's a Western liberal democratic system, the Weimar Republic was. And it's the concern that if you set up a system so that minority parties, like say the Green Party in Canada, which has, I believe, one seat at the moment, but has significant votes in various parts of the country that are not represented in Parliament, if you set things up so that they would be better represented in Parliament, you'd set things up so that a party that had a different goal, shall we say, without putting too fine a point on it, might find it easier to be elected. That's what's held theorists back from actually pushing for that. But the argument is a good one. I hope I've given you enough positive feedback on that one to see that it's a very good argument if you're saying it's not as democratic as it should be, but is anything as good as it should be?
Well, interestingly,
go ahead. Sorry.
that you bring up, Hitler. I mean, there are a lot of other places in, I think it's in New Zealand, various other places that use a proportional representation.
Yes.
But if you bring up something like Hitler, of course, people say, oh, God, we're not going to go there. So I think that's a kind of biased answer.
The thing is that it's that sort of thing, and I'm saying that this is the thing that quashes the idea. I'm saying it's that sort of thing from the 20s on that has made it more difficult to get PR, proportional representation, than might otherwise have done. I would just put that down to theories of human nature. In other words, if you have a fairly high view of human nature, you'd go straight for it. If you have a rather more negative view of human nature and the way people sometimes behave, then you'd be more skeptical. But I can see the point. I think the point is very well made. Thank you for the point.
And I saw Jason raised his hand. Jason?
Hi, Terry.
Yes.
My question is, so if independent is constitutional unworkable, but why Quebec, why in history Quebec they try to vote, and then that can be an issue for the Quebec to be separated from Canada?
Yes. Well, it's because of Quebec history. in the 1960s, there was a thing called La Révolution Tranquille, the quiet revolution. And what that basically meant was that the elements that had been powerful in in Quebec, lost their power in terms of popular support. The most important of those was the church, the Roman Catholic Church. So during the time of the church being very prominent in Quebec, and if you look at the speeches that were made at the time of Confederation debates, when Confederation was passed in 1867, there were debates in all of the parliamentary bodies across the country, in each of the provinces that would be part of the new country. And if you look at the Quebec debates, you will see that people who had supported the rebellion against the British were supporting the Constitutional Act of 1867 because of their fear of the United States. And it's very clear if you read the constitutional debates at the time. In other words, one of the biggest factor was in 1867 of the unity of the people who came together, first at Charlottetown, then at Quebec, and then in London, the final debate where the Queen signed the document. You can see that the unity was brought about by a fear of something external. And the Quebecois at the time thought of themselves, number one, as under threat by English-speaking people, which hasn't changed. That's still what they think. And number two, that other aspects of their culture, such as their religion, would be under threat by the Protestant United States. To be more specific, the Puritan United States, which of course is a kind of radical Protestantism. It's the sort of thing that's still stronger in the United States than it is in Canada. The Puritans of New England turning into transcendentalists or something, but it's still the same basic sort of thing. So the thing is that that was what moved them then. What happened beginning in the beginning of the 20th century is that gradually people started to move away from that idea because of the influence of large companies coming into the province and running the business, because the French Canadian educational system was controlled by the church, and so it produced lots of priests and produced lots of scholars of church history or whatever, but it didn't produce business people. And so Quebec was changing into a society in which the French Canadians wished to become part of a business culture. By the 1960s, the general public feeling in Quebec was that Quebec needed to adopt or begin to adopt a more independent role with regards to the rest of Canada, which was seen to be a threat, English language threat, to the rising new French Canadian middle class. I'm using sort of class analysis there to some extent, not because I'm a Marxist, but just because that's a useful analysis. I think it's quite relevant. So that by the time you get to things like the crisis of 1970, which we know about, it had reached almost a military stage where there were extreme elements, and I say extreme, who were in fact attempting to break Quebec free from Canada. Now, it came back from that into something that would be something that you could do under René Lévesque, and we're familiar with René Lévesque probably, who was a great thinker about this and came to the conclusion that Quebec's position in Canada would never meet the needs of the Québécois nation, as they started to refer to themselves. And of course, nation in French is not exactly the same thing as nation in English. It means people as well as entity, whereas in English it just tends to really technically just means state. So they were thinking of themselves as, in terms of survival in the emerging society that they were becoming very much a part of, because they were no longer a traditional society. You have to remember the French Revolution never took place in Quebec. It was part of Canada before the French Revolution, although the revolutionaries, the rebellion of 1837 was partly inspired by the ideas of the French Revolution, but they were unsuccessful in Quebec because it was still largely a very Roman Catholic society. I'm referring to the Quebecois themselves. Now, I don't know if that helps, but I think it's had its cycles since then, but I think they've just been cycles within the existing entity, which I think has been successful, the Canadian entity, which has moved from being the two solitudes, as they were famously called at one point by a Canadian author, to being people who see that they need to get along for practical purposes in the current world. I'll end my speech there. I don't know if that helps or not, but
Yeah, Ian raised his hand. Ian?
Terry, just to follow on, I think my understanding is that when a province holds a referendum on separation, what they're actually doing is saying to their government and to the Canadian government that they would like to negotiate the possibility.
correct.
So a vote on separation is not a done deal at that point. It's the opening of negotiations.
That's correct.
Okay. So I don't know if that addresses the previous question. It's not necessarily that you hold a vote in a province and then it separates. It's not that simple. There's a whole lot of constitutional wrangling that has to go on, and that could take decades to sort out.
Precisely. Precisely.
So in that case, so even though the Quebec people they vote and the majority decide to say, okay, I would like to independent from Canada, even though they are not able to independent because constitutional, because they are not, it is forbidden them to do that. So that vote only show the opinion of the population that say we do not like it. And then just as Ian said, the provincial government starting to negotiate from the federal, they would have some support. They just struggle for some favor from the central government. Is that the case?
You're on the right track, I think.
That's right.
The idea is that the vote gives the provincial government the mandate and the right to begin negotiations.
Correct.
Yeah.
But the Constitution give the right to the resident, give the right to the people of the provincial. They can vote. It is their
sure.
right.
Oh, that's right. That's right. And again, I'm going to come back to my same old point here about the reason why I think our system works so well. It does actually give a very large amount of actual democracy, while meaning people rule. I'm using the original definition of democracy from the Greek sources, Plato, Aristotle, etc., which is in one sense the worst form of government, as the Greeks thought, because you can get gangsters taking over. But as Churchill famously said, it's the worst form of government until you look at all the others. In other words, it's obviously not ideal. But then, are people ideal? I mean, is the world ideal? So the thing is that it allows the Canadian constitutional democracy allows for a great deal of freedom without license. This is the license, meaning you can do exactly what you please. One of the reasons, as an individual, one of the reasons why this has always been an ongoing issue in Canada is because there are two rival English speaking, and in one case, English and French speaking, versions of the liberal constitutional democracy that came from Britain, ultimately. One is the American, which I would argue was more like the Puritans were in the 16th century and 17th centuries, when they actually started a revolution that failed and was absorbed by Britain, by the existing British Constitution in the restoration of the monarchy. But the monarchy wasn't absolute anymore. Absolute monarchy is probably the worst form of government. It is the worst form, where somebody like a king or the king has all the power. Well, that's, of course, what happens in dictatorships. So the thing is that to avoid dictatorships and to allow the greatest amount of freedom possible on a whole number of issues. And Canada's a difficult country to govern because it's so disparate, so many different areas, long before immigration from other areas other than Britain and France occurred. It's been remarkably successful in doing that, and therefore, when Mr. Carney gave his, and I don't happen to be a member of the Liberal Party, but when Mr. Carney gave his speech at Davos, you have people of all stripes saying, the voice of the free world. Well, who's he quoting? He quotes Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. And then what did Mr. Polyev wisely say in response to that? He quotes Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, who was also a Stoic. They're going back to roots, not just roots of Britain, but roots of civilization, Western civilization. And if you want to get on with other civilizational areas, such as China, you have to get back to those sorts of things in your own civilization, rather than just throwing your weight around in the world. But as the empires did when the Europeans had European empires, you can't still behave like that anymore. I won't make too many obvious connections here, but you should be able to make them yourself.
This is a very interesting discussion, but I look at the time. Maybe it's time for Jen to give us that quiz so people can join, take part in the quiz. Then we can collect the name and do the lucky draw to give away these vouchers by El Premier Food Mart. Because yeah, we need to collect the names to do the lucky draw. But while our participants are doing this quiz, if you have any question to ask Terry or our advisors here, we can have an advisory meeting now. So Kai is here also, Martin, all here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So Jen, could you please do the
Okay,
quiz, please?
I'll send out the quiz right now,
Yeah.
and you
So
can, while people are doing the quiz, you can continue with the discussion if you like.
yeah. So one
Okay.
question we haven't mentioned is how to use this constitution in daily life. I'm just wondering, like we have all these obligations. It all looks obvious to us, but is there anyone who, do not do those things and be like sentenced to jail or what? Like you need to work, you need to support yourself, you need to support your family. These kind of obligations, like how you can break them, and if you break them, how you're gonna get punished? I'm just wondering. Okay, yeah, you have
Yeah, I haven't read the actual oath that is part of the citizenship process, but it sounds to me like what what is being captured in that oath is more it's more sort of putting you in mind of what makes a good contributing citizen
Mhm,
to a
mhm,
thriving society. And it's not necessarily something that if you don't do it, you're engaged in a criminal act, right?
mhm. Like if
If
you
you,
don't vote, you're not put into prison.
yeah, we don't have
Yeah.
any criminal statutes saying that if you don't vote, that's a criminal
Mhm,
offense and we're going to
mhm,
censure you
mhm,
for that. Okay. We're not going to put you in jail if you don't vote. Because
mhm,
frankly, a third to half the population doesn't vote in any given election,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
And there are no repercussions for that other than you may not get the government that you wanted.
So these obligations are more like a moral obligations for a good citizen.
They're a model
Mm,
of what civic participation that contributes to a positive society should look like.
mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And this I think it's very good.
Yeah.
Very good,
So
yeah.
there is a criminal code in Canada. And if you're really interested, you can read it. It's not very interesting reading, unless you're a criminal lawyer, I suppose. But yeah, being a good citizen is not necessarily you know, or rather not being a good citizen is not something that is a criminal offense in Canada.
Another question is, if we have our rights, this multicultural rights, this language, so what if our rights are infringed? What can we do, like in daily life?
This actually is a really interesting distinction because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that are part of the Constitution apply to the government. So what the Charter does is it spells out the circumstances under which a citizen can challenge a piece of legislation that the government has passed and argue that it is unfair under the provisions of the Charter. So if say the federal government were to pass a law, right, in the House of Parliament, they were to vote on it and pass it, and it were to receive royal assent, and there was something about that law that made its administration uneven in its application. So if it applied to some people and not others, or if it applied in a way that obviously discriminated against one class of people over another, then you as a citizen could launch a charter challenge to that piece of legislation, and the Supreme Court of Canada would review that application and either uphold that law, so basically saying that your challenge fails, right? You're not actually pressing on something that matters under the rules of the Constitution, or they would strike that legislation down. And they would ask the government, they would usually set a time frame for the government to either give up on that legislation or revise it to make it more fair. And that's what the Charter actually does. When it talks about for example, the areas that it's illegal to discriminate, they're not talking about daily interactions on the street, right? They're not talking about you interacting with a local business. That's not what the Charter covers. The Charter covers federal legislation and the actions of federally regulated entities. Like
not even provincial or municipal.
No.
Just the federal level.
That's right. That's a distinction that a lot of people really don't understand. And when you get into, if you encounter a situation that you think is discriminatory in your daily actions, that's where the provincial human rights codes come into effect. And the provincial legislation on what, that is based on those human rights codes. So it's a really interesting distinction that this separation between the federal government and the provincial governments and their jurisdictions is, your daily life is much more about municipal and provincial government activity than it is about the federal. Because as I said, it's really only when a federal piece of legislation is deemed to be discriminatory that the Charter comes into effect.
Wow, good to know. Thank you, Ian.
Yang,
Yes,
Nato
Madam.
here. Yes,
Hello.
I don't know how to raise my hand. I don't know
Oh,
how to do
sorry, I
that.
didn't hear it. Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
no, I did not know how to raise, to show the raising of hand. I don't know how to do
Then
that.
just unmute yourself, like, yeah,
Yeah,
like that.
I
Yeah.
just would like just to say something about the first question that was what I felt at the time that I became a citizen. Okay, I just started to memorize the All Canada. And then, of course, when it comes to constitution, the Philippines constitution, I am a Filipino, and it is really patterned to the US. We had our first constitution way back 1935, but we have a charter change, a constitutional convention wherein we made some amendments in our constitution in 1986. But most of the charters that we have are really patterned to the government or not, to the US. Because we were under the US for many, many years after the Japanese regime.
Mhm.
And in that, we have, of course, the House of Representatives, which we call the lower house, voted or elected by the number of people or the population in certain areas, okay, or in different regions. We have senators. We only have 24 senators, and these are elected by large, meaning by the whole population. My question is, how is it, or why is it that the senators of Canada are not elected? They are appointed and they can stay in their position for long and forever until their death, or perhaps the retirement or whatever. But in our case, it has always been elected just like the US. The only difference between the Philippine Constitution and the US Constitution is that we are a unitary kind of governance, while the government of the US is more of federalism. We are not a federal government. We are a unitary kind of government, meaning somehow centralized. All of the provinces, regions are under the president. But each one, of course, each province being governed by a governor.
Mhm.
But
So
in
maybe
each
we can ask
county,
Terry, like,
yes,
why Canadian Senate
senators
is
are not
appointed?
elected. They
I
are
think I
appointed.
think in Britain they just canceled this uh uh, same thing, like those
House of Lords,
yeah,
you mean?
they canceled it, right? They will remove this lifelong time, and also
That's right, in terms of the term, but not
yeah.
the idea.
Mhm.
That's
Because
not the
one needs to
idea,
know
right?
one needs to understand the fundamental philosophy behind the idea of having an upper house in the constitutional monarchy. It's sober second thoughts. Now, if since the 18th century, we've lived in the age of ideology, and I presume you know what I mean by ideology, which is belief systems which substitute for religions. In other words, surrogate, as the Canadian philosopher George Grant put it, surrogate religions masquerading as philosophy. So you have Marxism and you have the isms, basically. Not religion, of course, we can't do anything about that. But I'm referring to the political isms. So the thing is that in the party system that we have reflects that. The upper house comes from an earlier time, historically, before the party system. And of course, as you mentioned, in the House of Lords, it doesn't have to do with party connections directly. It may do indirectly, but not directly. So what the constitutional monarchy's theory is attempting to do is to retain elements from earlier ages that ideological societies like the United States have cut. What that does is to tell you, if you have to have a theory of history in order to understand the politics, it tells you that you're not the wisest thing that's ever lived. In other words, the way you may be doing things may not be such a good idea after all. So the upper house in Canada has been retained as a as a place of sober second thoughts. Now, does that mean that these people are not politicians? No, it doesn't mean that. They are politicians, but they're supposed to be mature. In other words, it recognizes the fact, which I think most societies and most times historically have recognized, that over time one is supposed to learn something. In other words, you're supposed to get wiser as you experience various things. So that's what the idea of the upper house is. Now, as you probably know, during the last few years, there have been some changes. There's a group of senators who are non-aligned, I think they call themselves, which is to say they're not obviously appointees of a prime minister who's obviously a member of a political party. These are people who are saying, well, we're sort of unaligned. And there was a move a few years ago to try and have elected senators, which didn't work out. It came from the West. It came from Alberta, basically. But Alberta is the most American of the Canadian provinces, even when one looks at the immigration into Alberta originally. They got over 1 million people, or actually it was the West in general, but most of them went to Alberta. So what you tend to have is a reflection of the Western United States to a very significant degree in Alberta. So there was a move to try and democratize, in an American sense, the Senate, but it didn't work out. I mean, it didn't continue. So what, in fact, I think is the justification for it is the idea that everyone is expected, under the general principle of having rights and responsibilities in our system, to responsibly look at the legislation and to see if it is, in fact, sane as opposed to insane, which is to say, realistic, principled, following the principles of the Constitution, all that kind of stuff. So it does have that. That's the theory of what the Senate is for in Canada. In the United States, as I was saying to you, in the American Senate, it's democratic, but there's only 2 members from each, they're elected, only 2 members from each state, regardless of the size of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you have other things in the United States which are different from the Canadian, such as the Electoral College. I think you probably know about that. So every elections go to be approved by the Electoral College for the president, for example. And that's coming from the 18th century as well. So Canada has, without cutting its roots from history, has managed to evolve, it would seem to me, as the country has evolved. And so we have a partially evolved Senate, but it's still got the principle of sober second thought by wise people who have long experience, that kind of stuff. That's the way I would defend it anyway.
Thank you. Yeah. So now, Stephen, could you please give the right answer to the quiz?
Okay.
And
Yeah,
then
so-
we'll ask Jane to run the lucky draw.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I when I read through the answers, I think all of you got the first 4 questions right. The only uncertainty is about the questions number 5, the 5th one. Yeah, so
Could you
the
please read the question and
questions.
give the
Oh,
right
okay.
answer? Yeah.
Yeah,
And
sure.
we have several vision impaired people here.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the first question is what are the most important Canadian rights? So I'll highlight some of them, including A, mobility rights, official language rights, and minority language education rights, and multiculturalism. Okay, so the answer is all of them. So the second question, please identify if the following statement is true or false. There's a clear distinction in Canada between the head of state, the sovereign, and the head of government, the prime minister, who actually directs the governing of the country. Yeah, so the answer is true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So number 3, please identify if the following statement is true or not. No bill can become law in Canada until it has been passed by both chambers and it has received royal assent granted by the governor of general on behalf of the sovereign. Yes, The answer is true. Number 4, what does the majority government mean? Okay, it means that the ruling party has the majority of seats in the House of Commons. That's answer A. So number 5, what were the provinces which achieved the responsible government first in Canada? Yeah, so you had to listen to the lecture I give today. Yeah, so the answer is D, the province of Canada, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. Yeah, everybody you have done good job. Okay, thank you for responding to that.
For inquiries, please contact info@eawlc.org or visit our website at www.eawlc.org.